Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Niall Ferguson, who is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. His new book is Kissinger, 1923 to 1968, The Idealist. Professor Ferguson is at Berkeley to deliver the R. Kirk Underhill Lecture for the Anglo-American Studies program at the Institute of Governmental Studies. Niall, welcome back to Berkeley.
Nice to be back, Harry.
Why are Anglo-American studies still important?
I don't think you can understand the history of the United States if you ignore its British origins, for one thing. I don't think you can really understand the history of the world unless you understand the extraordinary and disproportionate role played by what Churchill called the English-speaking peoples. And I think, perhaps lastly, it would be very difficult to make sense of contemporary developments in the United States if one knew nothing of the parallel developments in the UK. Populism is a word that's on everybody's lips these days. Well, we had a populist moment in Britain this year with the vote to leave the European Union, and I don't think that's irrelevant to the kind of debates that have been going on in the US around the presidential election campaign.
And what is it about populism as it's appearing all over Europe and in Great Britain and in the United States that invites a comparison?
Well, I think there's a global phenomenon, certainly a Northern Hemisphere phenomenon at work here, a backlash against globalization, not only economically, but one might say also culturally. And one of the arguments I want to make in my lecture is that if one looks closely at the case of the United Kingdom, one sees certain common features of this populist backlash that are also visible in the United States and elsewhere. There is certainly an argument about the economic consequences of global integration. But in particular, I think, there's an argument about immigration. And not only its economic consequences, but also its cultural consequences. So the Brexit vote back in June, the vote for Britain to leave the European Union, is a really interesting test of the power of populism. And one of the striking features of that vote was the way in which there were big differentials, both regionally and in terms of age groups, in the way that people voted. I'm a Scotsman. This may still be detectable in my idiosyncratic accent. Scotland voted to remain in the EU by quite a substantial margin. It was England and Wales that voted strongly to leave. Even more strikingly, and this seems to me highly relevant to the United States, there was a huge differential in turnout and voting between age groups. So relatively young voters, the under 25s, turned out at a rate of around 60%, but voted by a large majority to remain in the European Union. Voters aged 65 and older turned out at a rate of 90%, and they voted disproportionately to leave. I think it's very interesting to see how far populism is a partly regional phenomenon, but above all, it's a kind of demographically differentiated phenomenon appealing to older voters, and it's those older voters' reaction against the cultural as well as economic consequences of immigration who seem really, that seems really to be driving this movement.
And what is it about globalization, in addition to increased immigration, that leads to this dissatisfaction among this cohort you're talking about?
Well, I think if one begins with the economics, one gets a sort of rough idea of what's going on. What you've had in the last 25 years has been a really significant increase in international flows of goods, commodities, capital, people, and ideas. And all of these things have really significantly increased in volume. The migrant flows have made the United Kingdom really for the first time in its modern history, a major destination of immigrants, with net in-migration running at around 300,000 a year. That's a lot for
And are
Britain.
these mainly from Eastern Europe?
No,
Or no.
No. This is the interesting thing, that when you actually look at what's happening, about half of these people are not from the European Union at all. They're from all over the world, and the other half are indeed from the European Union. But of that European contingent, the East Europeans, the people from the relatively new member states of the EU, are actually quite a small fraction. But that's not how the world looks if you're a reader of the Daily Mail. If you're a reader of the Daily Mail, there's an enormous number of people from Poland and other East European states who are coming to the UK, and they're taking British jobs, or they're lowering the wages of British workers, and they're consuming public services, all of which is quite wrong. In fact, it turns out, if one looks at the role of the EU migrants, what they actually do is they come and they take jobs that would otherwise not get done. There's no zero-sum game here. Employment has increased for UK citizens enormously in the period of recovery that we've seen since 2008, 2009. And it's kind of hard to understand how that recovery would have gone if there hadn't also been migrant workers from the rest of the EU to take some of the jobs that were being created. And what's also very striking is that there are so many of these European citizens in work that they are clearly net contributors to the public purse. So there's a tremendous distortion when you get to the level of the media and of politics about what exactly is going on. And that gets me to the second point. This isn't really about economics, or at least it's only superficially an economic phenomenon. It's much more, I think, a reaction against the cultural changes that are associated with globalization, not just with immigration, but more broadly with globalization. And that's why it's significant that it's older voters in the UK who voted for Brexit, not because they had a tremendously sophisticated idea of the nature of Britain's relationship with the European Union, but more because they wanted to protest against changes that they have seen in their country over the period of, say, 20 to 25 years that have been, of course, partly economic, but mostly I think it's a cultural phenomenon that we're seeing here, a kind of rejection not just of a more multicultural society, but a rejection of a whole range of things that come with that. And some of the interesting polling that I'll talk about in my lecture relates to how people thought about a range of issues, including, for example, feminism, and how they voted in the Brexit referendum. And the correlations are extremely striking. Socially and culturally conservative attitudes match up with voting for leaving the EU. So voting to leave the EU is really a kind of proxy for a generalized protest against things that people just don't like about modernity. And not surprisingly, if you're 65 and older, and there's a lot you don't like about modernity because you remember things being different in your day. And I think that was a big part of Brexit. If you look at the US, the slogan "Make America Great Again" clearly resonates with a section of the population which is less well educated, older, whiter, and culturally conservative. And that I think is a really important parallel between the Brexit phenomenon and the Trump phenomenon.
To what extent should we look at the elites, the global elites, both in the United States and in Europe, and ask in what ways have they failed to getting ahead of the game with regard to this response which has come upon us?
I think hostility to elites who are perceived to be out of touch and perhaps even corrupt is a really important part of populism. I mean, I came up with a recipe for populism earlier this year that had 5 ingredients: the increase in immigration, the financial shock of the crisis, the increase of inequality, and the sense that the public institutions, the elites, are corrupt. Final ingredient is a demagogue. You put all those things together and boom, you have something pretty toxic in the kitchen. So I think the issue of the elites have failed played a really big part in the populist movements that we see all across the world right now. And I think there's some justification for this. It's very easy for someone like me, who is clearly a member of the global elite, you're one too, I mean, here we are, professors at elite institutions, to condescend to voters who are attracted to populist causes. But we have to acknowledge that they have some right to be aggrieved. After all, it was the elites who brought you the Iraq War. It was the elites who brought you the financial crisis. And I think from the vantage point of the imaginary median voter in both the UK and the US, the last 16 years has not been a particularly edifying spectacle, and it hasn't given you too much confidence in those elites who run the political and economic systems.
Is there a particular responsibility that falls on the United States and its elite because of its role as a hegemon in the post-World War world, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union?
Obviously, the United States has played a key role, not just since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, but since World War II. And American leaders, or American elites if you prefer, are the most important and influential in the world. So when the elites blunder, which I think it's quite reasonable to argue that they did, the rest of the world, and not only American voters, suffers. So I think part of what we see here is an understandable popular reaction against major failures of policy. And the populist critique on both sides of the Atlantic is not in that sense without some foundation. I mean, even if you take a specific example like immigration to the UK, you could argue that the inflows of workers to the UK and the decline of emigration from the UK are both signs of success. The UK's economy has been creating a lot of jobs, more than most of the continental European economies. But Britain's leaders did not do a terribly good job of explaining that. In fact, what they led people to expect was that they were going to reduce net migration. They were going to actually bring it down to more like 30,000 a year. When the numbers were persistently running at an order of magnitude larger, at 300,000 a year, people understandably were angry and felt that they'd been lied to. I think the financial crisis was a particularly important moment when the elites, both financial and political, were exposed for their incompetence. Hardly any of these people foresaw the crisis. I was one of a tiny number of people who argued in 2006, 2007 that we were heading for a major financial crisis and potentially a depression. So I think people are understandably angry that the entire financial system, which enriched bankers, and not only bankers, enriched a whole class of financial asset managers, and sometimes enriched the politicians, happened, and ordinary people paid the penalty, whether it was in the form of bank panics, lost houses, lost jobs. So I'm highly sympathetic to those people who are drawn to populists out of frustration with the status quo, because the status quo has not served them very well.
And were the elites in both Britain and here clueless about the political response that was coming from the people who it were hurting?
Actually, I think they were rather clueless. It was quite hard to explain in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis to politicians or to bankers that a major backlash was coming. And I had conversations with people in Wall Street, in Washington, in which I said, you do understand that after something this big, there's going to be a period when people are just focused on economically coping, and then there's going to be a major political backlash. And I argued in an interview in 2009 that there would be a populist response, and that in some parts of the world this would actually go from populism into violence. My prediction was that the post-crisis world would be a great deal more volatile, simply because it was such a large financial shock. And it not only cost people money, but it undermined the legitimacy of the regimes they lived under. It produced full-blown revolution, remember, in Middle Eastern and North African countries. We haven't gone that far, but if one looks at the ways in which people express their disapproval in elections, it's very clear that we've got a major political shift going on. And it's interesting because populism is a two-flavor product. You can have the left-wing flavor or the right-wing flavor, and they're available from all political ice cream stores. And so right now what you've seen in the US has been the populism of the left in the form of Bernie Sanders, then the populism of the right in the form of Donald Trump. To an historian of the Atlantic world, these are very familiar characters. You would have found very similar people in the late 19th century making very similar arguments against globalization. And the case I like to cite is Dennis Kearney. Nobody has ever heard of Dennis Kearney, but once upon a time, Dennis Kearney was the Donald Trump of California in the 1870s. It was Dennis Kearney and others who argued that the Chinese must go, that there should be an end of Chinese immigration into the United States. And they were successful because in 1882, the Exclusion Act was passed by Congress and Chinese immigration basically stopped. They didn't build a wall, but they didn't need to. Metaphorically, they did right across the San Francisco harbor.
And you've criticized the United States in the past for various deficits, a leadership deficit, a fiscal deficit, but you've also talked about a history deficit. So people don't know these stories from the past.
It's astonishing that this history of American populism seems largely to have been forgotten outside the academic world. And I've asked rooms full of people in the last few months, who has heard of Dennis Kearney? Now, maybe this being the United States of amnesia, in a few decades' time, nobody will have heard of Donald Trump. But right now, I think we do need to know about the early populists. We need to recognize that we've seen a version of this movie before. And in the late 19th century, which was an era of globalization, there were very profound anti-global movements on both the left and on the right. They were against immigration. They were against free trade. They were directed at financial elites, and they were actually pretty politically successful. The US policy on immigration was radically altered by this backlash, so much so that although we love to say the United States is a land of immigration and we're all immigrants, I'm an immigrant for sure, but in a long period of American history, beginning in the 1880s and continuing right through until the 1970s, actually, immigration was much reduced, much restricted. We've only really seen a return to late 19th century levels of immigration in the last 20 or 30 years. And we aren't yet quite back at that peak in terms of the percentage of the population that is foreign-born that was achieved in the 1880s. And guess what? It was in the 1880s that you had populism, and we're having it now. So I do think there's a very, very important analogy to be drawn here between late 19th century populism and what we now see. Those people who say that it's fascism, who draw analogies with the 1930s and 1940s, I think are overstating the case, because I don't think this is fascism. I think that's a category error. Fascism is different. Fascism is about uniforms, parades, it's about war. But populism isn't about those things. And populists are not militaristic. No matter how many ways you try to present him, I don't think Donald Trump is itching to launch a major war anywhere. I mean, beyond the destruction of Islamic State, he hasn't really offered as much more than trade wars. I think that's much more in the populist tradition, that you're not really that attracted by empire. If anything, you're an isolationist and you want to focus on domestic issues, and you want to build walls, you want to impose tariffs, and you want to bash those guys on Wall Street who seem to be the beneficiaries of globalization.
You've just, in the last year, published a book on Henry Kissinger. What did that journey, which is still continuing, in what way does what you've learned contribute to the discussion we're having right now?
A lot, actually. I spent a large part of the last 10 years working my way through Henry Kissinger's private papers and a whole bunch of documents and other archives that related to the first half of his life. So this first volume covers the period, as you mentioned, up until 1968 until the eve of his becoming Richard Nixon's national security advisor. Part of his life that's much less well known and much less well covered in other biographies. One of the documents that really caught my attention early on was a diary that he kept of the 1964 Republican National Convention, not very far from here in San Francisco, at which Barry Goldwater was nominated to run for president against Lyndon Johnson. And Kissinger's diary account of that event is fascinating because it was one of those occasions in modern American history when the right of the Republican Party got the upper hand over the more cosmopolitan centrist elements of the Northeast. And seeing Goldwater's supporters in full cry denouncing Kissinger's mentor in politics, Nelson Rockefeller, really shocked Kissinger and reminded him, as he confided in his diary, of his youth in Germany in the 1930s. Kissinger, having been born in Germany in 1923, had come of age under Hitler, had left Nazi Germany in 1938, not long before the disastrous and hideous pogrom of November that year, the so-called Kristallnacht. Kissinger had seen fascism up close, and his response to seeing the Goldwater supporters was, goodness me, this is all too reminiscent of fascism. But I think then as now, we've got to be very careful not to confuse populism and fascism, because I don't think the Goldwaterites were fascists any more than the Trump supporters mostly are. They're authentic American populists. And as an outsider who was only really becoming familiar with American politics in the 1960s, Kissinger was making a mistake that we see commonly made today, confusing populism, which is an important part of American political tradition, with fascism, which has never really been an important part.
How did you come to doing this biography of Kissinger?
Well, it was his idea. He and I met in London, I think it was in the early 2000s, and had a conversation about a book that I had written about the First World War. And in the course of subsequent correspondence, the idea came up that I might consider writing a scholarly biography of him. I don't think I was the first person he discussed this with. In fact, I know I wasn't. I think I was number 3 on the list, but I was the one who was mad enough to agree to do it. After an initial hesitation, I at first said no, because I felt this would be enormously difficult, which it was, and that at the end of it there would be a bunch of reviewers like Christopher Hitchens who would be extremely nasty about it, whatever I did. And although Chris Hitchens didn't live to review the book, there were a few reviewers of that kind of variety. So I hesitated, but then he cleverly invited me to come and look at some of the material in his private papers. And I remember sitting in Connecticut and looking through boxes of stuff from that early period and finding that diary from 1964 and realizing that it really was a fascinating and untold story. It was that same day that I saw some of his letters from the 1940s to his parents, saw an essay that he'd written during World War II at the time of his witnessing the liberation of a concentration camp. And I saw immediately in this early material a completely different figure from the Henry Kissinger of established accounts and indeed popular legend. So I was attracted to the project because it seemed like an opportunity to recast a reputation. And that's what I guess I'm in the midst of doing. I was right that it would be an enormous amount of work.
And what's extraordinary in your extremely well-written book, which reads like a novel, is as you quote from Kissinger's writings when he's in the military and then when he's in military intelligence after the war, the clarity and incisive writing that he was capable of at, say, the young age of 22 when some of this was written.
Writing, of course, in a language that he'd only begun to learn, really, in 1938 when he arrived in New York City. Yeah, these early documents are fascinating, and I realized that I was going to be telling the story of a really quite amazing life. Even the first half is a series of lives refugee in 1938, member of the proletariat in 39-40, working in a shaving brush factory
in New York.
In New York City, working nights, and then he's a soldier, then he's an infantryman. And then he's a Nazi hunter because he gets pulled out of the ranks around about the time of the Battle of the Bulge and becomes a counterintelligence agent, which meant in the final phase of the war, in the early stage of the US occupation of southern Germany, tracking down the most egregious offenders. So even in that early part of his life, an extraordinary amount happened. And luckily for me, the biographer, it was quite well documented in letters and other writings that survived. And then there's a whole other chapter, which is really a kind of chapter in American intellectual history, the chapter of his Harvard career as an undergraduate, a graduate, and then a junior faculty member, and ultimately a tenured faculty member. That was a story that I also found quite fascinating.
And we'll talk about that in a minute, but I want to understand the challenge that you face, because you're living in our times. You have a long list of books on finance and power, and you're dealing with a man who's become a misunderstood, very controversial figure. What are the challenges you face as you go through all of this documentation, ordering it, but then bringing an interpretation to it?
I suppose in terms of its scale, this book is a little bit like the history of the Rothschild banks and family that I wrote in the 1990s. And it's similar in a couple of other respects too. First, this is a chapter in Jewish history, in the history of the Jewish diaspora. And secondly, it is a subject that is highly controversial. In the 19th century, the Rothschilds were seen as wielding a malign and excessive power because of the size of their financial network. Well, in the late 20th century, and it continues to this day, Henry Kissinger has come to be identified as wielding a kind of malign and excessive power. And if you are a connoisseur of conspiracy theory websites, you will find often that the Rothschilds and Kissinger appear in the same rather sinister diagrams that the conspiracy theorists like to draw, with the Illuminati at the top and the Bilderberg group somewhere in the middle. So I think this is a similar problem in that we have a phenomenon that has been represented often in an extraordinarily negative light, that was historically significant and can be approached by the methods of historical scholarship, using in both cases documents that nobody else has ever really had access to.
As I went through the book, it's almost like there are four themes in a way implicit in what you're discussing. And let me just throw these out at you. One is Kissinger's ambition and how he climbs up the ladder of success in the national security field. Another is the development of his character. Thirdly is the history of ideas, because you call him an idealist, and you explain why that is so. He is a man of ideas who during this period really struggles with ideas. But then there's a body of his experiences. You've listed some of them. So all this time you're really tracking 4 lines of development. Is that fair?
I think it is. I mean, part of the challenge of writing a biography, if one wants to just focus on that as a technical problem, is that human beings are very complicated and often do and think contradictory things. But when we read about lives, we want them to make sense. We want there to be some literary coherence. And so the biographer's challenge, which distinguishes us from writers of fiction, is that we have to make sense of the really complex and sometimes contradictory characters that we have to deal with. And we have to recognize that people change over time, that the Kissinger of say, age 22, at the final phase of World War II is not the same Kissinger who is running US foreign policy in 1973-74. So I think that's a kind of technical challenge. The only way that I think you can overcome that and retain the reader's engagement is very explicitly to show where you think the turning points were. I don't, for example, think that Kissinger was driven by worldly ambition throughout his life. If you read Walter Isaacson's earlier biography, you definitely think that. But it came to me as rather different as I went through the documents. I think there was an intellectual ambition there that was inspired by Fritz Kraemer, his mentor, whom he got to know during the war. And that certainly propelled him to Harvard and through some fairly intensive study as an undergraduate and graduate. But I don't think there was much worldly ambition there until much later. And in fact, his early forays into the non-academic world of power were quite disastrous. So the notion of somebody carefully planning his ascent up the greasy pole, which I think you get in other earlier books, doesn't really seem to me to stand up to close scrutiny. Just to give you one example, why if you were ruthlessly ambitious, would you stick with Nelson Rockefeller through 3 unsuccessful bids for the Republican nomination? I mean, surely after 2 failures, you'd have jumped ship and signed up with the more likely winner in 1968, Richard Nixon. But Kissinger was very reluctant to do that, and indeed effectively asked Rockefeller's permission to accept when Nixon offered him a job. So I think that story is not the story that you're used to. It's a story of a rather academic and cerebral guy who ends up in the policy sphere because he kind of wants to influence policy, because he thinks mistakes are being made. It's not somebody, I think, who's pursuing power as an end in itself. And that brings me to one of your other themes, and that's the theme of the idealist. I think that subtitle is not just a provocation, though some people have read it as such. It's an attempt to show that in strict terms, Kissinger was an idealist. He was not a realist in the sense that we use the term in debates about international relations. He was an idealist in philosophical terms. He was somebody who criticized realism, looking back on the 1930s. He says of Chamberlain, he thought of himself as a tough realist. That's not intended as a compliment.
And he's also critical of Bismarck.
Absolutely.
Also, yeah.
So Bismarck is often identified with Kissinger because Kissinger wrote an essay about Bismarck, and people who can't really be bothered to read the essay say, oh, well, he was obviously the American Bismarck. But when you read what Kissinger wrote about Bismarck, including an unpublished book that I found in his papers, you find that essentially it's a critique of Bismarck, which culminates in an extraordinary passage in which Kissinger says you can't base policy on cynicism and realism because the public won't be with you, and ultimately you'll end up pursuing power as an end rather than as a means. So I think the young Kissinger defined himself in contradistinction to realism. This was also true in his interactions with Hans Morgenthau. It was true when it came to debating a whole series of practical policy issues, Vietnam in particular.
Nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons produced I suppose, reputation-making book, Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. But in that book, which again has been much misrepresented, Kissinger's making an argument about strategy, which is essentially based on the notion that you have to have some option in between surrender and blowing the world to kingdom come. It's not that Kissinger was itching for a limited nuclear war. It was that he saw you had to have a credible threat of an intermediate stage in order to have any leverage in negotiations with the Soviets. And I actually think that turned out to be right.
It's interesting because in a way what this first volume indicates is that Kissinger was a student of the world that he would inhabit in the second volume. And from all this reading and this march through his early years, you're coming up with certain themes, certain conclusions that he came up with about international politics and strategy. And I want to talk about those now. But we have yet to test them, and presumably that comes in the second volume, whether he will stick to those themes and whether how he will deal with the contradictions between those themes.
That's absolutely correct, Harry. I mean, Volume 2 will probably be called The Realm of Power. I give my wife credit for this. I used the phrase in one of the earliest talks I gave about the book, and afterwards she said, that's your subtitle for Volume 2. And I think it's right, because in Volume 2 he's no longer really the subject of, as it were, every sentence. He's an object of this extraordinary complex realm of power in Washington, D.C., in which at first he's rather a small player. And I'm very fascinated in Volume 2 to tell the story of his rise from real obscurity as National Security Advisor to a position of almost total dominance in the final phase of the Nixon administration. I think that the real trick here is to try to show how far the theories that he'd mapped out in the academy while at Harvard helped him in his time in government. Kissinger says in his own memoirs that you kind of live off your existing intellectual capital from the moment that you enter government. You don't have time to add to your intellectual capital, you don't have time to read. It's what you arrive knowing that helps you. And I'm fascinated to look at the ways in which that intellectual capital helped him, and the ways in which he had ultimately to reject some of the more idealistic notions that he'd acquired in the 1950s and 60s.
So in a way, he's heading through time, through an extraordinary opportunities and experiences, networking with a series of mentors who contributed to his intellectual development and his understanding of policy, and ultimately reaching certain very important conclusions about what policy making and strategic thinking was about. That's where we are, basically. And I,
right.
Yeah, go ahead. Please.
Well, Fritz Kraemer is this extraordinary figure he meets in the US Army, another exile from Nazi Germany, who's the one who spots Kissinger's intellectual potential and says, you know, forget accountancy at City College, you've got to go to Harvard and study philosophy and history. And I think that's very important, this moment of discovery by the somewhat Mephistophelian figure of Kraemer, who continues to play a part in the second half of the story. But then there's another mentor at Harvard, the rather larger-than-life Professor William Yandell Elliot, who sends Kissinger off to read the works of Immanuel Kant. Kant's a big part of the early Kissinger's intellectual development. That's a sense in which he's really an idealist in philosophical terms. Then there's Nelson Rockefeller, a completely different figure, who's attractive to Kissinger because he seems like a kind of Renaissance prince, and Kissinger sees himself as advising this politically powerful and charismatic figure who's not terribly intellectual or cerebral, but quite likes to have bright brains around him. At each stage in the story, there's somebody shaping and influencing the young Kissinger, but there's also a kind of product. An idea takes wing and produces some written work. The extraordinary book that he writes on the Congress of Vienna, this is A World Restored, in many ways the best book he ever wrote, an astonishingly brilliant exposition of what the balance of power really means. A book that policymakers should all be made to read because they mostly have a completely false idea of the balance of power. And then later on you have other really quite influential books like Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. I think the balance of power is the central Kissingerian concept. If you look at his most recent book, World Order, it's still pretty much as it was defined in A World Restored. And there are two things about the balance of power that Kissinger saw that very few of his contemporaries appreciated, and it's still not properly understood by most policymakers today. Number one, it's not naturally occurring. There needs to be a balancer. There needs to be, in fact, an active management of the balance in order to achieve anything like an equilibrium in the international system. And two, it needs to have legitimacy. the order, the balance, needs to be legitimate in the eyes of all the different elements. And if it's not, if there's a revolutionary power that comes along and questions that legitimacy, then it will be very hard indeed to avoid conflict. Now, that's a very useful way of thinking about, say, the modern Middle East. At a time when the Obama administration has placed a very big bet on its nuclear deal with Iran, predicated on a notion of balance that the president made quite explicit in some of the interviews he gave on the subject. The possibility exists that in Kissinger's terms, you're not going to get balance at all, because you're not really achieving balance, you're achieving an arms race. You're destabilizing and delegitimizing the order because Iran's a revolutionary power itself. I think that's a very helpful conceptual framework, one that I hadn't fully appreciated until I sat down and read my way through Kissinger's academic work. And I do think that even if he'd never become Secretary of State, if he'd been hit by a bus in January 1969, we would still have an incredibly important life to consider and a major contribution to the theory of international relations and indeed modern history.
Let me go over some of the themes that you pull out of there. As he's at the end of your book, he's about to go to the White House. He's been picked as National Security Advisor, and you say he brought to the White House his sense that most strategic choices are between lesser and greater evils.
This is a very important point. It may seem obvious, but sometimes you get the impression in discussions of foreign policy that people expect there to be a motherhood and apple pie option. But there are very, very few of those in foreign policy, and most decisions are choices between evils. Kissinger writes this in the 1950s, long before he's anywhere near the corridors of power. He says, in the Cold War, we have to face the fact that most of the choices we'll have to make will be between evils, and it will take a certain morality to be able to make those choices and recognize that they are, when we choose the lesser evil, we are doing it in the pursuit of a greater good. So I think that's a really, really important Kissingerian insight, and I'm constantly reminded of it, because most people who write from the academic world about foreign policy are very good at criticizing the decisions that presidents and secretaries of state take, but they very seldom make explicit what this preferable alternative would have looked like. They're far happier just pointing out that the act that was chosen was evil. But if the choice was between evils, what you really have to show is that it was more evil than some available realistic alternative. And very, very few people who write about foreign policy do that. They just let you think as a reader that there was some much easier thing that would have, say, ended the war in Vietnam sometime in February 1969.
The other point that he emphasizes is the importance of historical self-understanding to not only understand how to deal with adversaries, but how you can deal with them, basically because of the pressures they're under.
I think at a time when game theory was becoming increasingly fashionable amongst nuclear strategists, Kissinger stood out as somebody who studied history. And let's face it, if you were an ambitious young man in the early 1950s, you probably wouldn't choose as a topic for your doctoral dissertation the time of Castlereagh, Metternich and the Congress of Vienna. So Kissinger chose history and focused on historical knowledge at a time when it was far from fashionable. And I think this is another argument against the scheming, ambitious figure in other biographies. The key insight that Kissinger gleaned early on was that history is to states what character is to individuals. If you don't know the history of Russia, you will not be able to understand the way in which the Russian leader, in our time President Putin, thinks. You won't understand what it is that he prioritizes, and therefore you won't really understand your rival. You're negotiating with somebody whose character has been shaped by their country's history. And this importance that Kissinger attaches to historical understanding was one of the things that really drew me to the subject. There are very few people with real historical knowledge who have entered the realm of power, Not many professors of history, and although he was a professor of government, he was in effect a professor of history. Not many people who have worked in that field have ended up in the Situation Room. And in that sense, it's quite interesting to ask how far historical knowledge really did give Kissinger an advantage. I think it did. I'm strongly of the view that decision makers benefit from historical knowledge, if only because they understand their interlocutor better when they're negotiating with someone from abroad.
And in making choices, a third theme is that you have to conjecture, basically, about the situation. There are many known unknowns, so to speak, to quote Secretary Rumsfeld.
So the problem of conjecture, which is how Kissinger describes it, is the most profound idea that I found in researching this book. And I still remember being very struck by the power of the idea when I first encountered it in an essay from the early 1960s. And this is how Kissinger explains the problem of conjecture. He says, at any given moment, a decision maker confronts a line of least resistance, which in effect involves doing nothing, or as we would say, kicking the can down the road, and hoping, like Mr. Micawber in Dickens, that something turns up. So you do the easy thing and you hope for the best. The alternative is that you take action in the here and now in the hope of averting some disaster in the future. And that's hard to do because if you act here and now, you have to persuade people to sacrifice resources, maybe even men, to the course of action that you've chosen. The asymmetry, and here's the beauty of the idea, is as follows. If you are right in acting, in taking option 2, the harder course, and you avert disaster, nobody will thank you, because nobody is grateful for averted disasters, i.e. things that didn't happen. If you take the line of least resistance and do nothing, kick the can down the road, you may get lucky, and disaster may not happen. But if it does happen, then you'll have found out the hard way that you should have acted. So this is the central problem of conjecture for decision makers. They cannot make the decision on the basis of data. Kissinger's very clear about this. You can't just sit waiting for the data, for the information to tell you what to do, because you're conjecturing about the future at the point of decision. You have to take a decision. And he shows this, I think, very elegantly with a case, a historical example that had greatly affected him and his family. He says, in 1938, nobody really knew if Hitler was just another German nationalist or a genocidal maniac. Well, they opted to play for time. That was the essence of the policy of appeasement, and they ultimately found out that he was a genocidal maniac, and tens of millions of people lost their lives as a result, including, of course, at least a dozen members of Kissinger's family who died in the Holocaust. So for Kissinger, the problem of conjecture was a very live, burning issue. He saw that the greatest error in 20th century international relations was the policy of appeasement. And he spent much of his career in the 1950s and 60s and 70s trying to make sure that no such mistake was made again, acting rather than not acting, rarely kicking the can down the road, choosing between evils and paying the price in terms of the current and subsequent criticism. But I think always understanding clearly that there is a problem of conjecture with every decision that you take. You can never be sure you were right. You can never be sure you averted disaster. You can never prove that détente successfully prevented World War III from happening, to take just one example. You can't really prove that. And in that sense, the statesman's fate is essentially that of a tragic hero. The statesman's trying to conjecture about the future. The statesman, as Kissinger depicts him in A World Restored, is essentially ahead of the electorate, ahead of the population, trying to see disasters that nobody else is thinking about. If he successfully acts to avert catastrophe, he will not be thanked for this. On the contrary, he'll likely be blamed for whatever short-term action he took. And that's the tragic fate that Kissinger kind of foresaw for himself.
And finally, he came to recognize, as his ideas developed, the importance of understanding that you need to bring the public along with you as you ventured into the world. And some would say he failed. We'll find out in the second volume when it came to Vietnam and he was in power.
This, it seems to me, is another part of the tragedy. Kissinger's writing on Bismarck, which we briefly talked about before, identified a central problem, that if one is purely cynical and realistic in one's calculation, if one pursues a Bismarckian policy, you're unlikely to have public support because you'll be doing things that require what Kissinger calls the courage of cynicism, something notably lacking in the American public. So you don't really have a choice. You've got to persuade voters that these lesser evils really are lesser evils and that they're worth doing to avoid future potential disasters. I think it's pretty clear already from the existing literature that Kissinger's attempt to sell détente politically in a series of speeches that he made all over the United States failed, and that the critique of détente that Ronald Reagan in particular spearheaded was very effective. And ultimately, détente was a dirty word by the late 1970s. So I think it's already obvious that part of what's tragic about Kissinger's story is that he can never really persuade Americans that the strategy that he and Richard Nixon devised in the early 1970s as a way of dealing with America's profound problems at that stage in the Cold War was legitimate, was the lesser evil.
So we're now positioned, after reading the near 1,000 pages of your book, to better judge whether Kissinger in power in the next volume lives up to the principles that he came to in this period when he laid the foundation in history and in philosophy and in understanding that he came to himself. So I guess it would be to preview, for the preview, we need to go back to Kraemer's warning to him. His mentor advises him that now that you have assumed this position, it's much harder than academic intrigue and ambition. You are going to be tempted. You are beginning to behave, and he warns Kissinger, you're beginning to behave in a way that is no longer human, and people who admire you are starting to regard you as cool, perhaps even cold. You are in danger of allowing your heart and soul to burn out in your incessant work. And he goes on to warn him about maintaining his integrity and respecting the integrity of others, and to really maintain his own character.
It's not often that a biographer gets documentation this good, because there's something wonderfully literary about the way Kraemer writes, warning, admonishing his protege. Kraemer saw himself as a Mephistophelian figure, and he clearly saw Kissinger as his Faust. So there's a sense in which Kraemer was somewhat dramatizing the relationship. But the story continues in Volume 2 and ultimately produces a bitter breach between Kissinger and Kraemer, which for me is a really critical moment in Volume 2. Those letters are a wonderful source, because you see here personified that dialogue between the worldly and the rather less worldly, between the pupil and the master, a dialogue that had begun in, of all places, a basic training camp in the American South in World War II. And I guess part of the difficulty of writing historical biography is often that you don't get the sources to give your story a real literary kick. Well, thanks to Kraemer's letters, I get quite a lot of literary kick here. It's really extraordinary to have the dilemmas of power so starkly illustrated, and to have somebody who sets himself up in the role of Kissinger's conscience and writes it all down.
One final question. We're almost out of time, so a brief answer. What have you learned from this work over and above what you've learned about Kissinger? How has it informed your understanding?
That's an easy question to answer. When I wrote a book called Colossus about American power more than 10 years ago, I thought there were three deficits that constrained the United States. A manpower deficit in the sense that Americans don't really want to go abroad and work and fight in hot, poor, dangerous countries. A fiscal deficit in the sense that the whole thing was getting more and more unaffordable, and an attention deficit because American voters lose interest in foreign policy after 4 years. But then I realized, writing the Kissinger biography, that there was this fourth deficit, the history deficit, that we actually live in the United States of amnesia, and the lessons of Vietnam haven't been learned at all. Somebody, I won't name him, who read this volume wrote to me saying he couldn't believe how familiar Kissinger's reflections on Vietnam in the mid-1960s were, because they reminded him of all the things that had been said about Iraq in the mid-2000s. So part of the important message this book conveys is that we need to make the study of history mandatory for American decision makers. It's not a sort of part of the entertainment industry. It's central to how we should educate the people who run this country. And I'd say also the people who run its major corporations. Ignorance of history turns out to be one of the most dangerous features of the American political system. We almost select out the people who know their history and choose people who think that things can be figured out on first principles. And Kissinger saw this problem in the 1960s. He regularly wrote about it and warned that you can't make strategy with the techniques of a Wall Street lawyer on a case-by-case basis. So I think that's really the big message that this book conveys, that history is central. It's not peripheral, it's central to strategy. And Kissinger was very unusual in his generation for seeing that. He's still unusual here in 2016 when he's 93 years old. He's still unusual for seeing that.
Well, on that note, Neil, I want to thank you for writing this book, which is a great read. I must tell our audience that it's like reading a novel, actually. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.